Picture this. Somewhere in the vast bureaucratic nightmare that is the Galactic Safety Commission, a report marked "Catastrophic Failure" lands on the desk of Inspector Quinbert Flabbernook with the sound of impending doom. The report is 3,000 pages long, written in the apologetic tone of someone who has just discovered that their entire career is about to become a cosmic joke. Earth, third planet, from an unremarkable star. Population, approximately 8 billion creatures who have somehow managed to survive despite having the collective safety awareness of a particularly reckless lemming convention. Quinbert Flabbernook, whose species had evolved from creatures that considered looking both ways before crossing the street to be advanced quantum physics, stared at the report with the kind of horror usually reserved for discovering that your favorite restaurant has been serving you something that was definitely not chicken for the past 20 years. "What the bloody hell is this?" he squeaked, his voice reaching frequencies that would make dolphins file noise complaints. The report was clear. Earth had failed every single safety test the Galactic Safety Commission had ever devised. Not just failed, spectacularly failed. The kind of failure that makes other failures look like rousing successes by comparison. Test 1. Basic Planetary Hazard Assessment. Earth's score, -47. The examiners had noted that Earth's inhabitants had somehow managed to make their planet more dangerous than when they first arrived. They had split atoms for fun, created weapons capable of destroying their entire species multiple times over, and then, and this was the part that made Quinbert's antennae twitch uncontrollably, they had used those same weapons to make electricity. Test 2, Species Survival Instinct Evaluation. Earth's score does not compute. The testing equipment had literally given up, trying to understand why humans would voluntarily jump out of perfectly functional aircraft, climb mountains that were clearly trying to kill them, and consume beverages that were technically classified as industrial solvents in 17 different star systems. Test 3, Logical Decision-Making Assessment. Earth score, undefined error. The computers had crashed, trying to process the concept of humans who knew something was dangerous and decided to do it anyway because it was dangerous. Test 4. Environmental Adaptation Protocols. Earth score, -infinity. The evaluation team had discovered that humans had somehow managed to survive in environments ranging from frozen wastelands that would kill most species in minutes, to scorching deserts where water was more precious than diamonds, to dense urban environments that violated every known principle of sustainable living. But here was the kicker. They were thriving in these conditions. They had even invented something called extreme sports, which appeared to be a systematic attempt to find new and creative ways to nearly die while having fun. Test 5. Communication and Cooperation Standards. Earth's score, error 404, logic not found. The researchers had documented humans who would argue violently about the correct way to pronounce certain words, then immediately unite to help a complete stranger who was in trouble. They had witnessed humans who would complain bitterly about their governments, while simultaneously organizing elaborate volunteer efforts to help their communities. The evaluation team had given up trying to categorize human social behavior after documenting something called British politeness, which appeared to be a complex system of expressing extreme displeasure through increasingly elaborate forms of courtesy. But here's the thing that made Quinbert's head hurt. In ways that defied the laws of physics. According to the report, these humans weren't just surviving, they were thriving. They were laughing, they were making jokes about their own mortality while simultaneously inventing new ways to accidentally kill themselves. "This is impossible," Quinbert declared to his empty office, because even his assistant had learned to avoid him when he was having one of his existential crises. "No species can be this reckless and still exist. It violates the fundamental laws of natural selection." He pulled up the detailed observations section, and that's when things got really weird. The field researchers had documented humans who would see a sign that said, "Danger, do not touch," and immediately develop an overwhelming urge to touch whatever it was. They had found humans who would test the sharpness of knives by running their fingers along the blade. They had witnessed humans who would see a wet floor sign and somehow interpret it as a suggestion rather than a warning. The research team had also documented something called Murphy's Law, which humans had somehow codified as anything that can go wrong will go wrong. Instead of using this knowledge to prevent disasters, humans seemed to treat it as a challenge. They had developed an entire philosophy around the concept that if something was going to go wrong anyway, you might as well enjoy the ride. The most disturbing part? The humans seemed to find all of this hilarious. Quinbert's colleague, Meredith Bumblebottom, had been the lead researcher on the human project. She had returned from her fieldwork with a nervous twitch and a tendency to burst into uncontrollable laughter at inappropriate moments. Her final report had been written entirely in capital letters and ended with the phrase, "I need a very strong drink and possibly therapy." The appendices to her report contained detailed observations that had caused 3 different review committees to request immediate transfers to other departments. There was the incident with something called Black Friday, where humans had demonstrated their ability to organize complex strategic maneuvers that would make military generals weep with envy, all for the purpose of purchasing consumer goods at slightly reduced prices. The violence and coordination displayed had been so impressive that the Galactic Military Academy had requested copies of the footage for training purposes. Then there was the documentation of human festivals, which appeared to be organized attempts to violate as many safety protocols as possible while calling it fun. The researchers had observed something called Burning Man, where humans voluntarily subjected themselves to extreme heat, dust storms, and social conditions that would be considered torture in most civilized systems, all while creating elaborate art installations and maintaining an atmosphere of joyful celebration. The report also included observations of human extreme sports, which the research team had initially assumed was some form of ritualized suicide attempt. Upon closer investigation, they discovered that humans had systematically identified every possible way to nearly kill themselves while moving through space, and had turned each method into a competitive activity with complex scoring systems and enthusiastic spectators. Bungee jumping had been particularly baffling to the research team. Humans would voluntarily attach themselves to elastic cords and throw themselves from great heights, apparently for no other reason than to experience the sensation of nearly dying and then not dying. The fact that they paid money for this experience had caused the Economic Analysis Division to request additional funding to study what they termed the complete breakdown of rational resource allocation behavior. Right, Quinbert muttered, straightening his regulation safety helmet. If I'm going to understand these humans, I need to observe them myself. How dangerous could it be? The universe, had it been capable of laughter, would have found this statement absolutely hilarious. Before departing for Earth, Quinbert spent several days studying the preliminary cultural briefings that had been compiled by previous research teams. The more he read, the more convinced he became that the humans had developed an entirely different relationship with reality than any other known species. There was something called British humor, which appeared to be based on the principle that the worse a situation became, the funnier it was supposed to be. The research team had documented humans who would maintain elaborate jokes in the face of natural disasters, personal catastrophes, and what appeared to be the complete collapse of their social institutions. They had witnessed something called gallows humor, where humans facing life-threatening situations would engage in increasingly elaborate wordplay and comedic observations. The researchers had been particularly baffled by documented cases of humans who, while trapped in elevators or stuck in traffic jams, had somehow managed to turn their predicament into impromptu comedy performances for their fellow sufferers. The cultural analysis team had also struggled to understand something called self-deprecating humor, where humans would voluntarily make themselves the target of jokes, apparently as a form of social bonding. This behavior violated every known principle of status competition and self-preservation, yet it seemed to be one of the most effective methods humans had developed for forming social connections. Quimbert's first stop was a place called England, which, according to the reports, was where humans had perfected the art of making everything slightly more dangerous than it needed to be, while maintaining an air of polite resignation about the whole thing. The cultural briefing had prepared him for some of the more obvious hazards of British society: the tendency to drive on the wrong side of the road, the consumption of beverages that were hot enough to cause serious burns, and something called queuing, which appeared to be a complex social ritual involving standing in organized lines for extended periods while discussing the weather in increasingly elaborate detail. What the briefing had not prepared him for was the sheer creativity humans displayed in finding new ways to make simple activities unnecessarily complicated and potentially hazardous. He materialized in the middle of a small town called Little Wickhamshire, disguised as a human safety inspector. This, he felt, would allow him to blend in naturally while conducting his research. His first encounter was with a human named Bernadette Crumpetshire, who was doing something that the Galactic Safety Commission's computers had classified as statistically impossible to survive. She was riding a bicycle. Now, to most species in the galaxy, the concept of balancing on two wheels while hurtling through space at speeds that could result in serious injury was considered a form of elaborate suicide. But Bernadette was doing it while reading a newspaper, eating a sandwich, conducting a conversation with someone on a small communication device, and somehow managing to navigate around obstacles that would have required his species to conduct detailed environmental impact assessments before attempting to circumnavigate. "Excuse me," Quimber called out, his voice cracking slightly. "Are you aware that you're engaging in approximately 14 different safety violations simultaneously?" Bernadette stopped her bicycle with a casual grace that defied several laws of physics. She performed this maneuver while somehow managing to catch her sandwich, fold her newspaper, and end her phone conversation without dropping any of these items or losing her balance. "Oh, are you from the council? About bloody time. I've been trying to get them to fix that pothole on Bramblewood Lane for months. Nearly came off my bike there yesterday. Had a right good laugh about it." Quinbert blinked. You laughed about nearly having an accident? Well, of course. What else are you going to do? Can't spend your whole life worrying about every little thing, can you? Life's too short for that nonsense. This was exactly the kind of response that had been documented in the reports, but hearing it in person made Quinbert's brain feel like it was trying to solve a mathematical equation where all the numbers had been replaced with tiny screaming faces. But you could have been seriously injured," he protested. "Could have been, but wasn't, was I? Besides, if I worried about every little thing that could go wrong, I'd never leave the house. And where's the fun in that?" Bernadette gestured toward the street around them, which Quinbert now noticed was filled with humans engaging in various activities that would have required safety committees and risk assessment protocols in any civilized society. There were children playing games that involved running at high speeds while not paying attention to their surroundings. There were adults operating vehicles that appeared to be held together by optimism and mechanical prayers. There was an elderly man attempting to trim hedges using tools that looked like they had been designed by someone who had only heard about the concept of safety through a series of increasingly garbled telephone conversations. "Look at that," Bernadette said, pointing to a woman who was walking a dog that appeared to be at least 3 times her size, while simultaneously managing to carry multiple shopping bags and have an animated conversation with a neighbour. "That's Mrs. Pembleton walking Rupert. Dog's a bit overeager, and she's a bit unsteady on her feet, but they've been doing that walk together for 15 years. Sure, there have been a few mishaps, but they sort themselves out, don't they? As if summoned by this observation, Mrs. Pembleton's dog suddenly spotted something interesting across the street and lunged forward with the enthusiasm of a creature that had never heard of traffic laws. Mrs. Pembleton, rather than being dragged into oncoming traffic as Quinbear expected, somehow managed to turn the dog's momentum into a complex pirouette that ended with both of them safely on the sidewalk, her shopping bags intact and her conversation apparently uninterrupted. "See," Bernadette said cheerfully. "Works out fine. Always does somehow." Quinbert made a note in his official notebook. Human subject displays complete lack of self-preservation instinct while maintaining inexplicable cheerfulness about potential mortality. Also appears to possess some form of probability manipulation technology. His next encounter was with a human called Reginald Toffiam, who was engaged in what humans apparently called DIY, an acronym that Quinbert was beginning to suspect stood for Destroy It Yourself. The cultural briefing had mentioned DIY as a peculiar human practice where individuals would voluntarily attempt to perform complex technical tasks despite having no formal training, professional qualifications, or apparently any understanding of the fundamental principles involved. The practice seemed to be motivated by a combination of economic considerations and what the researchers had termed inexplicable optimism about their own capabilities. Reginald was standing on a ladder that was clearly not designed to support his weight, while attempting to repair something called a roof using tools that appeared to have been designed by someone who had only heard about the concept of safety through a series of increasingly garbled telephone conversations. The ladder itself was a marvel of engineering incompetence. It was positioned at an angle that violated basic trigonometry, supported by what appeared to be a combination of garden furniture and wishful thinking. Reginald had somehow managed to achieve a state of precarious balance that suggested he was operating according to laws of physics that had not yet been discovered by galactic science. "I say," Quinbear called up, "are you aware that your ladder is positioned at a mathematically unstable angle and appears to be held in place by what I can only assume is wishful thinking?" Reginald looked down with the kind of cheerful obliviousness that had been known to cause mental breakdowns in safety inspectors across the galaxy. "Oh, it's fine. Been using this ladder for 20 years, haven't I? Sure, it's a bit wobbly, but what's the worst that could happen?" As if summoned by this question, the ladder immediately began to wobble in a way that suggested it had been waiting for exactly this moment to demonstrate what the worst that could happen actually was. Quinbert watched in horror as Reginald began to fall, fully expecting to witness what humans would undoubtedly classify as a tragic accident. Instead, he watched as Reginald somehow managed to grab onto a drain pipe, swing across to a window ledge, bounce off a conveniently placed awning, catch hold of a tree branch, perform what could only be described as an impromptu gymnastic routine, and land feet first in a pile of leaves that had been raked up moments earlier. "Blimey!" Reginald shouted, brushing leaves from his hair. "That was a bit more exciting than I expected. Good thing I moved those leaves this morning, eh?" Quinbear's notebook fell from his trembling hands. According to every law of probability he knew, Reginald should have been seriously injured. The sequence of events he had just witnessed should have been impossible. There had been too many variables, too many opportunities for disaster, too many moments where the laws of physics should have intervened to produce a tragic outcome. "How?" Quinbert whispered. "How did you know the leaves would be there?" "Didn't, did I? Just lucky, I suppose, though I always say you make your own luck in this life." "Well, most of the time. Sometimes luck just sort of happens to you, doesn't it?" Reginald gathered up his tools with the casual efficiency of someone who had apparently been defying probability on a regular basis for decades. "The trick is not to think about it too much. Start worrying about all the things that could go wrong, and that's when they actually do go wrong. Better to just get on with it and see what happens. This was the moment when Kinbert began to suspect that humans might not be operating according to the same fundamental laws of reality as the rest of the universe. His suspicions were confirmed when he encountered a human called Prudence Wafflebottom, who was engaged in what she described as cooking dinner for the family. Kinbert had studied the reports on human food preparation, and he thought he was prepared for what he might witness. The cultural briefing had described human cooking as a complex process involving the controlled application of heat to various organic materials, with elaborate safety protocols to prevent contamination, burns, and food poisoning. He was wrong. Nothing could have prepared him for watching Prudence simultaneously juggle flaming pans, sharp knives, and what appeared to be a small explosion, while maintaining a running commentary on the weather and her neighbor's questionable choice in garden ornaments. The kitchen was a chaos of activity that would have required a team of professional risk assessment specialists to navigate safely. There were open flames, boiling liquids, sharp objects being manipulated at high speeds, and what appeared to be several different chemical reactions occurring simultaneously. Steam was rising from multiple sources. Timers were beeping in complex rhythms, and there was a distinct possibility that at least one of the cooking processes was approaching critical mass. "The trick," she explained, while somehow managing to flip what looked like a pancake that was actively on fire, "is to not think about it too much. The moment you start worrying about all the ways it could go wrong, that's when it actually does go wrong." Kinbert watched in fascination as she caught the flaming pancake with one hand while using the other to prevent a pot from boiling over, and somehow managed to add ingredients to a third cooking process using what appeared to be her elbow. "But surely you must have some sort of safety protocol, some kind of systematic approach to preventing disasters?" Prudence laughed, a sound that somehow made the chaos around her seem less chaotic. "Oh, darling, if I had a safety protocol for everything, I'd spend so much time following protocols that I'd never actually get anything done. Besides, where's the adventure in that?" She gestured toward the kitchen, where approximately 17 different potential disasters were occurring simultaneously, and yet somehow everything was working out perfectly. The timing of various cooking processes seemed to be coordinated by some form of intuitive understanding that defied systematic analysis. "Life's messy, isn't it? You can either spend your time trying to make it neat and tidy, or you can learn to dance with the mess. I prefer dancing." This was the moment when Kinbert realized that he was dealing with something far more complex than simple recklessness. These humans weren't just ignoring safety. They were operating according to an entirely different understanding of how the universe worked. The cultural briefing had mentioned something called intuition, which humans seemed to treat as a legitimate decision-making process, despite the fact that it appeared to be based on no quantifiable data whatsoever. They would make complex judgments about timing, probability, and risk assessment based on what they described as gut feelings and hunches. What was even more baffling was that this approach seemed to work. The humans consistently achieved positive outcomes through processes that should have been completely unreliable. But the real revelation came when he encountered a human called Nigel Biscuitbottom, who was engaged in what he described as just popping down to the shops. This, Kinbert had learned, was human code for embarking on a quest that would make epic heroes weep with envy. The cultural briefing had described shopping as a simple economic transaction where humans would exchange currency for goods and services. What it had failed to mention was that this process required navigating through environments that had apparently been designed by a committee of sadists with advanced degrees in chaos theory. Nigel's journey to the shops involved crossing a street that was clearly designed by someone who had never actually seen a human being in motion, navigating through a construction zone that appeared to be actively trying to kill anyone who entered it, and somehow managing to avoid being hit by a bus that was being driven by someone who had apparently learned to drive by watching action movies. The street crossing alone would have required Quinbert's species to conduct detailed traffic flow analysis, install safety barriers, and coordinate with multiple emergency services before attempting to traverse. The construction zone violated so many safety protocols that Quinbert wasn't sure it was technically legal for it to exist. "Bit of a close one there," Nigel said cheerfully, as the bus missed him by approximately 3 millimeters. "Good thing I stepped back when I did." Quinbert, who had been holding his breath for the entire journey, finally managed to speak. "How did you know to step back?" "Didn't, really. Just felt like the right thing to do. You develop a sort of sixth sense about these things after a while." "A sixth sense? Well, you've got to, haven't you? Can't go through life expecting everything to be perfectly safe." "Universe doesn't work that way, does it?" Nigel continued his journey with the casual confidence of someone who had apparently spent decades developing an intuitive understanding of probability, momentum, and the fundamental unpredictability of mechanical systems operated by other humans. "The thing is," he continued, while somehow managing to navigate around a hole in the sidewalk that appeared to violate local building codes, "you can spend your whole life trying to avoid every possible danger, but then you're not really living, are you? You're just existing in a bubble of safety protocols and risk assessments." This was the moment when Quinbert began to understand something that would fundamentally change his understanding of the cosmos. Humans weren't reckless because they were stupid. They were reckless because they understood something about the nature of existence that his species had never grasped. The universe, as any reasonable being knew, was fundamentally chaotic. Most species dealt with this by creating elaborate safety systems, detailed protocols, and comprehensive risk assessments. They tried to make the universe predictable and safe. Humans had taken a completely different approach. They had looked at the chaos of existence and decided to laugh at it, not because they didn't understand the dangers. They understood them perfectly well. They laughed because they had figured out that the alternative was to spend their entire lives paralyzed by fear of all the things that could go wrong. Quinbert's mind reeled as he processed this revelation. He thought about his own species, with their safety helmets and risk assessment forms and elaborate protocols for everything from crossing the street to making a cup of tea. They had spent so much time trying to make life safe that they had forgotten to actually live. But humans had figured out that life was inherently unsafe, and they had decided to enjoy it anyway. This realization was interrupted by a loud crash from somewhere nearby, followed by the sound of human laughter. Quinbert rushed toward the sound and found a human called Millicent Puddingworth standing next to what appeared to be the remains of a very expensive-looking garden gnome. "Oh, bugger," she said, but she was laughing as she said it. "That's the third one this month. You'd think I'd learn to look where I'm going by now, wouldn't you?" "Aren't you upset?" Quinbert asked, still trying to process what he was seeing. "Upset? About a garden gnome? Oh, darling, life's far too short to get upset about garden gnomes. Besides, it was probably an improvement. Hideous thing, really. My sister gave it to me for Christmas, and I've been trying to figure out how to get rid of it without hurting her feelings." She looked at the broken pieces with the kind of satisfaction usually reserved for people who had just solved a particularly difficult puzzle. "Problem solved, I'd say." Quinbert realized that he was witnessing something that his species had never developed, the ability to find humor in disaster. Not because the disaster wasn't real, but because laughter was the only reasonable response to the fundamental absurdity of existence. He began to understand why the Safety Commission's tests had been so baffled by humans. They had been trying to measure human behavior against standards that assumed beings wanted to minimize risk and maximize safety. But humans had long ago figured out that a life spent minimizing risk was barely worth living. This understanding was put to the test when Quinbert encountered a human called Barnaby Crumpetbottom, who was engaged in what he described as A bit of gardening. Ooh, the cultural briefing had described gardening as a peaceful activity involving the cultivation of plants for aesthetic or nutritional purposes. What it had failed to mention was that humans had somehow managed to turn this simple process into an elaborate dance with mechanical death. Barnaby was operating a machine that appeared to have been designed by someone who had only heard about the concept of safety through a series of increasingly disturbing nightmares. The machine made sounds that suggested it was actively trying to escape from its own mechanical existence, while somehow managing to accomplish the seemingly impossible task of making grass shorter. The device appeared to be powered by controlled explosions, which humans had somehow decided was an appropriate method for maintaining decorative vegetation. It moved across the ground with the unpredictable, lurching motion of something that was constantly on the verge of achieving sentience and immediately using that consciousness to plot revenge against its operators. "Lovely day for it," Barnaby shouted over the mechanical screaming. Nothing like a bit of fresh air and honest work to put things in perspective. Kinber watched in fascination as Barnaby navigated around obstacles that would have required his species to file environmental impact reports and conduct 3 different safety assessments. The human seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to avoid the various ways the machine was trying to kill him. The garden itself was a testament to the human ability to create beauty through barely controlled chaos. There were flowers that had been planted in arrangements that defied conventional understanding of color theory, yet somehow achieved visual harmony. There were trees that had been pruned using techniques that appeared to violate the basic principles of plant biology, yet somehow produced magnificent displays of foliage. "How do you do it?" Quinber asked, when the machine finally stopped its attempts at mechanical murder. "Do what?" "Survive. You're surrounded by dangers that would terrify most species in the galaxy, and you're enjoying it." Barnaby looked genuinely puzzled by the question. "Well, what's the alternative? Spend your whole life hiding indoors, worrying about what might happen. That's not living, is it? That's just existing." He gestured toward his garden, which was undeniably beautiful, despite having been created using tools that appeared to have been forged in the fires of mechanical hell. "You can't make something beautiful without taking a few risks. Beauty doesn't come from playing it safe." Barnaby wiped his hands on a cloth that was covered in substances that would probably require hazardous material disposal protocols in any civilized society. "Besides, you learn things when you take risks. Every mistake teaches you something new. Every near disaster shows you something about how the world works that you never would have learned from a manual." This was the moment when Quinbert finally understood why humans had failed every safety test the Galactic Safety Commission had ever devised. They weren't failing because they were incompetent. They were failing because they were playing by completely different rules. The tests had been designed to measure compliance with safety protocols. But humans had discovered something that no other species had figured out. Sometimes the safest thing you can do is to stop worrying about safety and start paying attention to life. Quinbert's revelation was interrupted by what humans would undoubtedly describe as a bit of a situation. A large piece of construction equipment had broken free from its moorings and was rolling down a hill toward a group of humans who were engaged in what they called having a picnic. Any reasonable species would have run screaming in the opposite direction. The humans did something that made Quinber's brain feel like it was trying to solve a puzzle made entirely of contradictions. They laughed. Not because they didn't understand the danger, they understood it perfectly well. They laughed because they had figured out something that Quinbert's species had never discovered. Sometimes the best way to deal with a crisis is to find it funny. "Well, that's not supposed to happen," shouted a human called Cordelia Bumblebottom as she calmly moved her picnic blanket out of the path of the runaway equipment. "No, I don't suppose it is," agreed another human, whose name was apparently Rupert Toffyham. "Good thing we brought the emergency tea, eh?" Quimber watched in amazement as the humans calmly relocated their picnic while maintaining what could only be described as a running comedy commentary on the situation. They weren't panicking or running away. They were treating the whole thing as an unexpected form of entertainment. The runaway equipment appeared to be some form of earth-moving device that had achieved independent motion through what Quinbert could only assume was mechanical rebellion. It was rolling down the hill with increasing momentum, leaving a trail of destruction that would require extensive paperwork to properly document. "I wonder if it's insured," mused a human called Tabitha Crumpetworth, while setting up a new picnic location with the efficiency of someone who had apparently dealt with similar situations before. "Oh, bound to be," replied Cordelia. "Everything's insured these days. Probably costs more to insure it than it did to buy it in the first place." Still," said Rupert, producing a thermos of tea from somewhere, "makes for an interesting afternoon, doesn't it? When's the last time you saw a proper runaway bulldozer?" The runaway equipment eventually came to a stop in a pond, where it made a sound like a very large and very disappointed mechanical whale. The humans applauded. "Brilliant!" shouted Cordelia. "Best dinner theatre we've had in ages." This was the moment when Quinbert finally understood what made humans unique in the galaxy. They had discovered that life was fundamentally unpredictable, and instead of trying to fight that unpredictability, they had learned to dance with it. Other species spent their time trying to control the chaos of existence. Humans had figured out that the chaos was the point. They had learned to find joy in uncertainty, humor in disaster, and beauty in the completely unexpected. Quinbert realized that he needed to completely rewrite his report. The humans hadn't failed the safety tests. The safety tests had failed to understand humans. The problem wasn't that humans were unsafe. The problem was that safety, as the Galactic Safety Commission understood it, was based on the assumption that the goal of existence was to minimize risk. But humans had discovered that the goal of existence was to maximize life, and life, by its very nature, was risky. This revelation was both terrifying and liberating. It meant that everything Quinbert thought he knew about how intelligent beings should behave was wrong, but it also meant that there was a completely different way of existing in the universe, a way that embraced uncertainty instead of fighting it. Quinbert's philosophical crisis was interrupted by the arrival of a human called Mildred Cranklebottom, who was carrying what appeared to be a small dragon. "Oh, hello there," she said cheerfully. "You haven't seen a small dragon about, have you? This little fellow seems to have wandered off from the others." Quinbert stared at the creature, which was definitely a dragon, albeit a small one. According to every report he had ever read, dragons were mythological creatures that existed only in the fevered imaginations of primitive species. Yet here was a human casually carrying one, like it was some form of domestic pet. "Others?" he managed to croak. "Oh yes, I run a small dragon rescue center. Nothing fancy, just a few dozen dragons who need a bit of care and attention. They're lovely creatures, really, once you get to know them." The dragon in question chose that moment to breathe a small puff of fire, which singed Mildred's eyebrows. She laughed. "Oh, you little rascal. I keep telling them that's not how we say hello to new people." Quinbert realized that he was having a conversation with a human who ran a dragon rescue center and was treating fire-breathing creatures like they were slightly mischievous pets. "Isn't that dangerous?" he asked weakly. "Well, of course it's dangerous. They're dragons. But that doesn't mean they don't deserve love and care, does it? Besides, once you understand their nature, they're no more dangerous than any other creature. Well, perhaps a bit more dangerous, but that's part of their charm." Mildred adjusted her grip on the dragon, which was now eyeing Quinbert with the kind of interest that suggested it was calculating the optimal fire-breathing angle. "The trick is to not let them know you're afraid. Dragons can sense fear, you see. Show them respect, treat them with kindness, and they'll generally return the favor." "Generally?" "Well, they are still dragons. They have their moods, just like anyone else. Sometimes they get a bit cranky, especially during molting season, but that just means you have to be extra patient with them. This was the moment when Kinber finally understood the true nature of humanity. They weren't just comfortable with danger. They were capable of finding beauty and meaning in the most dangerous situations imaginable. They didn't run dragon rescue centers despite the danger. They ran them because they understood that something didn't have to be safe to be worth caring about. Quinbert's understanding of humans was further complicated when he encountered a human called Archibald Biscuitworth, who was engaged in what he described as a bit of amateur archaeology. This turned out to involve digging holes in his backyard while following a map that had been drawn by his great-great-grandfather, who had apparently been convinced that there was buried treasure somewhere on the property. The map itself was a work of art that would have challenged the most advanced cartographic analysis systems in the galaxy. It was drawn on what appeared to be the back of a napkin, using symbols that seemed to have been invented on the spot, and included directions like turn left at the old oak tree and dig where the shadows meet at sunset. Been at it for 15 years now, Archibald explained, while showing Quinber a hole that appeared to violate several laws of physics. Haven't found any treasure yet, but I've found some absolutely fascinating bottle caps and what I'm fairly certain is a Victorian-era shoe. The backyard looked like the site of an archaeological expedition that had been organized by a committee of enthusiastic amateurs with unlimited time and no understanding of proper excavation techniques. There were holes of various sizes scattered across the landscape, each representing years of dedicated searching based on increasingly creative interpretations of the original map. "And you're happy with that?" Quinbert asked, still trying to understand how someone could spend 15 years looking for something they hadn't found. "Oh, absolutely. The treasure's not really the point, is it? The point is the digging. There's something deeply satisfying about making a hole in the ground and seeing what you find, even if it's just bottle caps and old shoes." Archibald gestured toward his backyard, which now resembled a lunar landscape crossed with a small-scale mining operation. "Besides, you never know what you might find next. That's the beauty of it, the possibility. The moment you stop looking is the moment you guarantee you'll never find anything." He showed Kinbert a collection of artifacts that he had accumulated over the years, rusty metal objects of unknown purpose, fragments of pottery that could have been from any century, and what appeared to be the remains of various mechanical devices that had been buried for reasons that would probably never be understood. "Look at this," he said, holding up a twisted piece of metal. "Haven't got the faintest idea what it is, but it's definitely old. Might be part of a Victorian agricultural implement, or possibly a piece of military equipment from the war. Could be anything, really. That's what makes it interesting." This was the moment when Kinbert realized that humans had discovered something that no other species had figured out. The joy of the search itself, regardless of what you actually found. His species would have calculated the probability of finding treasure, determined that it was statistically unlikely, and abandoned the project. Humans had calculated the same probability and decided to enjoy the process anyway. Quinbert's understanding was further expanded when he encountered a human called Beatrice Puddingbottom, who was engaged in what she described as a bit of creative cooking. This turned out to involve combining ingredients in ways that would have been considered war crimes in several star systems, while somehow managing to create something that smelled absolutely delicious. The kitchen was a laboratory of culinary experimentation that operated according to principles that defied conventional understanding of flavor compatibility, nutritional science, and basic chemistry. Beatrice was in the process of creating something that appeared to involve chocolate, curry powder, pickled vegetables, and what looked like breakfast cereal. "The secret," she explained while adding what appeared to be chocolate to what was clearly a savory dish, "is to not think too hard about whether things are supposed to go together. Some of the best discoveries happen when you ignore the rules." Quinbert watched in fascination as she created something that should have been inedible, but was instead making his mouth water in ways that defied his understanding of xenobiology. "But what if it doesn't work?" he asked. "Then it doesn't work, and we order takeaway. But what if it does work? What if we discover something absolutely wonderful that nobody's ever thought of before?" She stirred the mixture with the confidence of someone who had apparently spent years systematically violating the established principles of culinary science. "I once accidentally created the most amazing soup by mixing ingredients I thought would be terrible together. Turned out to be the best thing I'd ever made. Now it's a family recipe. How do you know what combinations to try? I don't. That's the point. If I knew what would work, it wouldn't be an experiment, would it? The fun is in the not knowing." This was the moment when Quinbert realized that humans had discovered the secret to innovation, the willingness to fail spectacularly in the pursuit of something wonderful. His species would have followed established recipes and achieved predictable results. Humans had decided that predictable results were less interesting than the possibility of creating something amazing. Quinbert's philosophical journey was interrupted by what humans would undoubtedly describe as a bit of excitement. A large tree had fallen across the main road, blocking traffic and creating what any reasonable species would consider a significant problem. The humans treated it as an opportunity for a spontaneous street party. "Well, that's torn it," shouted a human called Reginald Crumpetworth, but he was grinning as he said it. "Looks like we're not going anywhere for a while." Within minutes, someone had produced a guitar, someone else had brought out sandwiches, and someone had started organizing what appeared to be an impromptu talent show. The blocked road had been transformed from a crisis into a celebration. The speed with which this transformation occurred suggested that humans had developed some form of collective unconscious protocol for converting obstacles into entertainment opportunities. Without any apparent coordination or planning, the stranded motorists had spontaneously organized themselves into what could only be described as a small festival. "How do you do that?" Quimber asked a human called Tabitha Biscuitworth, who was somehow managing to teach a group of strangers to perform a complex dance routine while simultaneously organizing a potluck dinner using ingredients that people had apparently been carrying in their vehicles for exactly this type of emergency. "Do what?" "Turn a problem into a party." Tabitha looked genuinely puzzled by the question. "Well, what's the alternative? Stand around complaining about it? That's not going to move the tree, is it? Might as well make the best of it." She gestured toward the impromptu celebration that had erupted around the fallen tree. "Besides, when's the last time you had a chance to have a proper street party? These things don't happen very often. Might as well enjoy it while it lasts." Quinbert observed as humans, who had been complete strangers minutes earlier, were now engaged in collaborative activities that would have required his species to conduct extensive social compatibility assessments before attempting. There was singing, dancing, storytelling, and what appeared to be competitive juggling using items that people had found in their cars. A human called Montgomery Crumplebottom had somehow produced a full tea service from his vehicle and was methodically serving hot beverages to anyone who wanted them. When Quinbert asked how he happened to have a complete tea setup in his car, Montgomery looked at him as if the question made no sense. "Well, you never know when you might need a proper cup of tea, do you? Always best to be prepared." This was apparently considered perfectly reasonable behavior by the other humans, who accepted their tea with the same casual attitude they had shown toward the falling tree, the runaway construction equipment, and every other apparent disaster Quinbert had witnessed. Another human, whose name was Prudence Cranklethorpe, had begun telling stories that seemed to involve increasingly elaborate accounts of previous transportation mishaps she had experienced. Each story was funnier than the last and seemed to inspire other humans to share their own tales of automotive adventure. "There was the time my car broke down in the middle of a snowstorm," she was saying, "and I ended up spending the night in a stranger's barn with 12 other stranded travelers, 2 sheep, and a very friendly dog named Wellington. By morning, we'd organized a poetry competition, and someone had taught us all to knit. "What happened to the car?" someone asked. "Oh, turned out it just needed petrol. I'd forgotten to fill it up before leaving. But I got the most wonderful scarf out of the experience, and I'm still friends with half the people from that barn." The audience laughed and applauded, and someone else immediately began a story about the time their train had been delayed for 6 hours, and the passengers had organized an impromptu talent show that had been so successful they'd missed their connections on purpose. This was the moment when Kinbert finally understood the fundamental difference between humans and every other species in the galaxy. Other species saw obstacles as problems to be solved. Humans saw obstacles as opportunities to be enjoyed. They didn't just adapt to changing circumstances, they found ways to celebrate them. Quinbert's revelation was complete when he encountered a human called Mortimer Wafflebottom, who was engaged in what he described as a bit of philosophical contemplation. This turned out to involve sitting in a chair in his garden, drinking tea and watching clouds. The cultural briefing had mentioned human fascination with meteorological phenomena, but had failed to adequately explain the depth of their engagement with apparently random atmospheric events. Mortimer was not just watching clouds, he was studying them with the intensity of a scholar examining ancient texts. "Fascinating things, clouds," Mortimer explained when Quinbert asked what he was doing. "Never the same twice, are they? Always changing, always becoming something new, rather like life when you think about it." Kinbert looked up at the clouds, which were indeed changing shape in ways that seemed somehow meaningful. As he watched, a formation that had resembled a sailing ship gradually transformed into something that looked like a dragon, then shifted again into what might have been a castle or possibly a very large hat. Do you do this often?" "Every day, if I can manage it. It's important to take time to notice things, don't you think? The world's full of wonder, but you have to pay attention to see it." Mortimer took a sip of his tea and continued watching the sky with the patient attention of someone who had discovered that the universe was constantly putting on a free show for anyone who bothered to look up. Most people are too busy rushing around to notice the small miracles that happen every day. Clouds forming and dissolving, birds choosing exactly the right moment to sing, the way light changes throughout the day. It's all quite remarkable, really. But isn't it inefficient to spend time watching things that don't accomplish anything? Mortimer looked at Quinbert with the kind of gentle surprise usually reserved for someone who has just asked why people bother to breathe. "Accomplish anything? My dear fellow, what could be more important than paying attention to the fact that you're alive, that you exist in a universe full of beauty and wonder and completely unexpected moments of joy?" He gestured toward his garden, which Quinbert now noticed was arranged in such a way as to maximize the opportunities for observing natural phenomena. There were bird feeders positioned to attract different species at different times of day, plants chosen to bloom in sequence throughout the seasons, and carefully placed seating areas that offered optimal viewing angles for various celestial events. "The accomplishment," Mortimer continued, "is the awareness itself. Every moment you spend truly paying attention to the world around you is a moment when you're fully alive. Everything else, all the rushing and worrying and trying to control things, that's just existing. This is living." This was the moment when Quinbert realized that humans had discovered something that his species had completely missed: the importance of simply existing in the moment without trying to control or analyze or improve it. They had learned to find meaning in the simple act of being alive. As Quinbert continued his observations, he began to notice patterns in human behavior that suggested a fundamental understanding of existence that was completely alien to his own species' approach to life. He encountered a human called Wilhelmina Puddingsworth, who was engaged in what she described as creative problem-solving. This turned out to involve fixing a broken garden gate using materials that included a bicycle wheel, several pieces of string, a collection of bottle caps, and what appeared to be part of a defunct umbrella. "The trick," she explained, while somehow managing to create a functional hinge mechanism from components that had no obvious relationship to each other, is to not get hung up on how things are supposed to work. Sometimes the best solutions come from ignoring the proper way to do things and just figuring out what actually works. She stepped back to admire her creation, which was undeniably functional, despite looking like it had been assembled by someone who had only heard about the concept of mechanical engineering through interpretive dance. Besides, where's the fun in just buying a proper gate when you can make one from bits and pieces? Anyone can solve a problem with the right tools and materials. The real challenge is solving it with whatever happens to be lying around. Quinbert watched as she tested the gate, which opened and closed smoothly despite its unconventional construction. According to every engineering principle he knew, the device should not have worked. Yet it was clearly functional and had been created using a process that seemed to involve equal parts creativity, optimism, and what could only be described as inspired improvisation. He encountered a human called Percival Bumblethorpe, who was engaged in amateur astronomy. This involved studying the night sky using equipment that appeared to have been assembled from household items and what looked like the remains of several broken telescopes. "Built it myself," Percival explained proudly, showing off a device that looked like it had been designed by someone who had received conflicting instructions about how optical instruments were supposed to function. "Took me 3 years and parts from about 15 different sources, but it works better than anything you can buy in the shops." Through this improvised telescope, Quinbert could see celestial objects with remarkable clarity. The device should not have been capable of producing such high-quality images, yet it was clearly superior to professional equipment that cost hundreds of times more to produce. "How did you know how to build it?" "Didn't really. Just kept trying different combinations until something worked. Made a lot of mistakes along the way, but that's how you learn, isn't it? Each mistake taught me something new about how light behaves." This was another example of the human approach to learning that Quinbert was beginning to recognize. They seemed to prefer discovery through experimentation rather than instruction through formal education. They would rather figure things out for themselves, even if it took longer and involved more failures, because the process of discovery was apparently more valuable to them than the efficiency of receiving correct information. He encountered a human called Esmeralda Crumpetbottom, who was engaged in creative writing. This involved creating elaborate fictional narratives about characters who did not exist in situations that had never happened, for the apparent purpose of exploring philosophical questions that had no definitive answers. "The wonderful thing about stories," she explained, while writing in a notebook with the kind of focused concentration usually reserved for complex mathematical calculations, is that they let you explore all the possibilities that reality doesn't provide. You can ask what-if questions and follow them to their logical conclusions without having to worry about the practical consequences. She showed Quinbert pages covered with intricate plot lines involving characters who faced moral dilemmas, impossible choices, and situations that tested the boundaries of courage, compassion, and wisdom. "But these people don't exist," Quinbert pointed out. "These situations aren't real. What's the purpose of spending time thinking about imaginary problems?" Esmeralda looked at him with the kind of patient expression teachers use when explaining basic concepts to students who are struggling with fundamental principles. "The problems may be imaginary, but the solutions reveal something real about the nature of existence. When you explore how someone might behave in an impossible situation, you learn something about the range of human possibility. The stories aren't about what happened, they're about what could happen and what that tells us about who we are." This was another aspect of human thinking that defied the logic Quinbert's species had developed. Humans seemed to value hypothetical scenarios as much as actual experiences. They would spend significant time and energy exploring imaginary situations, apparently because they believed that understanding fictional possibilities somehow enhanced their ability to deal with real circumstances. Kinbert returned to his ship with a head full of observations and a heart full of confusion. He had come to Earth expecting to find a species that had somehow survived despite their obvious incompetence. Instead, he had found a species that had discovered a completely different way of existing in the universe. The report he would write would be unlike anything the Galactic Safety Commission had ever received. It would challenge every assumption they had about intelligent behavior, safety protocols, and the nature of existence itself. But first, he had to figure out how to explain what he had learned to beings who had never learned to laugh at danger, find joy in uncertainty, or discover beauty in chaos. He began to type his report, and after several false starts, he found himself writing something that would change the way the galaxy understood intelligence itself. "The humans have not failed our safety tests," he wrote. "Our safety tests have failed to understand humans. They operate according to a completely different understanding of what it means to be alive. They have discovered that existence is not about minimizing risk. It is about maximizing joy, wonder, and connection with the fundamental absurdity of being conscious in an unconscious universe." He paused, staring at the words on his screen. They seemed inadequate to capture what he had witnessed, but they were the best he could do. "The humans laugh," he continued, "not because they don't understand the dangers they face, but because they have discovered that laughter is the only reasonable response to the beautiful, terrifying, completely unpredictable miracle of being alive." He described the humans he had met, their willingness to embrace uncertainty, their ability to find meaning in apparently meaningless activities, their talent for converting disasters into celebrations. He wrote about their dragon rescue centers and their amateur archaeology projects, their creative cooking experiments, and their philosophical cloud watching. "They have learned something that our civilization has never grasped," he wrote. "They understand that the purpose of intelligence is not to control the universe, but to appreciate it. They have discovered that the highest form of safety is not the absence of danger, but the presence of joy in the face of uncertainty." As he wrote, Kinbert began to understand that his report would not be well received by his superiors. The Galactic Safety Commission had built their entire civilization around the principle that intelligent beings should minimize risk and maximize predictability. The human approach to existence challenged every fundamental assumption they had about the nature of consciousness and the purpose of life. "The humans have failed our tests," he concluded, "because our tests measure the wrong things. We have been testing for compliance with safety protocols when we should have been testing for the ability to find meaning in chaos, joy in uncertainty, and beauty in the completely unexpected. By our standards, the humans are dangerously reckless. By their standards, we are tragically dead inside." Kinbert submitted his report and waited for the inevitable response from his superiors. He didn't have to wait long. "Inspector Flabbernook," came the reply, "your report has been classified as evidence of complete mental breakdown. Please report for immediate psychological evaluation and reassignment to a desk position involving no contact with alien species." But Kinbert was already packing his bags. He had learned something from the humans that his species had never taught him. Sometimes the most important discoveries come from ignoring the rules and following your own path. He wrote a resignation letter that was brief and to the point. "I hereby resign from the Galactic Safety Commission to pursue advanced studies in applied existence appreciation. I will be conducting my research on Earth, where I intend to learn how to live instead of merely existing." He was going back to Earth, not as an inspector, but as a student. He wanted to learn how to laugh at the universe, find beauty in chaos, and discover joy in the magnificent, terrifying, completely wonderful experience of being alive. As his ship lifted off from the bureaucratic nightmare of the Galactic Safety Commission's headquarters, Quinber found himself doing something he had never done before in his entire life. He laughed. Not a polite chuckle or a nervous giggle, but a full-throated expression of joy at the absolute ridiculousness of spending your existence trying to make an inherently chaotic universe safe and predictable. He laughed at the safety protocols and risk assessments and elaborate procedures that had governed every moment of his life until now. He laughed at the beautiful absurdity of a universe that had somehow produced beings capable of recognizing their own cosmic insignificance and deciding to find it hilarious. And somewhere in the cosmic background radiation of the universe, the sound of that laughter joined the eternal chorus of human joy. The sound of beings who had looked at the vast, dangerous, utterly unpredictable cosmos and decided that the only reasonable response was to find it absolutely, completely, wonderfully hilarious. Because sometimes the most profound safety protocol of all is learning to laugh at the beautiful absurdity of existence itself.